Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe pull the blanket up a little higher, because tonight we are heading somewhere almost nobody talks about, Niger. Not Nigeria, the big coastal country you have definitely heard of. Niger, its quieter, drier, landlocked neighbour up in West Africa, a country most people could not find on a map with a flashlight and a week to spare. Which is honestly criminal, because what is sitting under Niger's sand might be the single strangest layer cake of history we have ever cracked open on this channel. Right now, if you flew over the place, you would see nothing but heat shimmer and dunes for hours in every direction, one of the most punishing landscapes on the entire planet. And yet buried in that same sand are the skeletons of 6-foot-tall fishermen who once harpooned giant perch on a lake that has not existed for thousands of years. There are giraffe carvings the size of a house, and underneath all of that, there are dinosaurs. Real ones, with teeth like a lawnmower blade and snouts built like a crocodile, resting under dunes that have not felt rain in longer than anyone can comfortably imagine. So tonight we are going to peel back every one of those layers, nice and slow, the way we like it around here. Before we get going, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are listening from tonight. And if you have not subscribed yet, go ahead and take care of that now, so you do not miss the next one. Okay, lights down. Let's sink into Niger. Chapter 1. The land that forgot it was once green. Let's start with the shape of the place, because Niger is big in a way that does not really register until you compare it to something familiar. We are talking roughly 1.2 million square kilometers, which makes it more than twice the size of Texas and comfortably bigger than France, Germany, and the United Kingdom stacked together. It is landlocked, sitting in the gut of West Africa with Algeria and Libya up north, Chad to the east, Nigeria and Benin down south, and Mali and Burkina Faso off to the west. And yes, before anyone's autocorrect starts arguing with them, Niger and Nigeria are two entirely different countries that just happen to share a name, a border, and a river. Think of them as siblings who went to very different schools. One became the massive, oil-rich megacity powerhouse of Africa. The other became one of the emptiest, hottest, quietest countries on the continent. This chapter is about the quiet one. And quiet does not even begin to cover it. About 2/3 of Niger sits inside the Sahara Desert, which means for a huge stretch of the map, we are simply talking sand, rock, and heat that seems to have a personal vendetta against you. Deep in the northeast is a stretch called the Tenere, which the local Tuareg nomads translate, more or less, as desert within a desert. Picture the driest, most featureless place you can imagine, then remove the features you are still imagining. Flat gravel plains stretch to the horizon in every direction. No trees, no water, no landmarks except the occasional dune the size of an apartment building. For centuries, the Tenere was considered one of the single most desolate places a human being could stand, and it earns that reputation completely. Now let's talk about the heat, because Niger routinely gets ranked among the hottest countries on Earth, and it is not close. In the oasis town of Bilma, out in the Tenere, the mercury has been recorded at a scarcely believable 48.2 degrees Celsius. Which is about 119 degrees Fahrenheit. And that was not even a freak outlier. Average highs from April through September regularly sit somewhere between 40 and 44 degrees Celsius. For reference, that is the kind of heat where stepping outside without water is not a lifestyle choice, it is a decision with consequences. Air conditioning, where it exists at all, is less a luxury and more a basic human right that the climate keeps trying to repeal. Running through the middle of the country like a nervous transition zone is the Sahel, a band of semi-arid scrubland that separates the true desert up north from the slightly greener savanna down south. The word Sahel actually comes from an Arabic term for shore, as in the shore of the desert, which is a genuinely beautiful bit of imagery for a region that spends most of its time trying not to drown in sand. Rainfall here is thin and wildly unpredictable. Farming is a gamble every single season, and the desert has been steadily creeping south for decades, swallowing farmland one dry year at a time. It is the kind of slow-motion disaster that never makes headlines because nothing explodes, nothing catches fire. The sand just quietly wins, a little more every year. But Niger is not wall-to-wall punishment, and its one great mercy runs through the southwest corner of the country, the Niger River. It is the third longest river in Africa, behind only the Nile and the Congo, tracing a strange looping crescent for roughly 4,200 kilometres from the highlands of Guinea up through Mali, before finally curling down into Niger and onward into Nigeria. The capital city, Niamey, sits right on its banks, and for good reason. Everywhere else in the country is negotiating with the sun. Along the river, there is actually a fighting chance at agriculture, fishing, and something resembling a normal water supply. If the rest of Niger is a furnace, the river valley is the one crack in the wall where you can feel the air conditioning. Up in the north, rising straight out of the desert floor, is the Air Massif, a jagged triangular block of ancient volcanic mountains that looks almost like a geological mistake in the middle of all that flatness. Its tallest peak, Mont Idoukalentagez, tops out at just over 2,000 metres, making it the highest point in the entire country. Cut between the peaks are deep, narrow valleys called corris, which act like natural plumbing for the rare rains, channeling just enough moisture to keep pockets of vegetation alive. Herders have used those corris for a very long time to graze cattle and camels in places that, from a distance, look like they could not support a single blade of grass. It is basically a mountain range that decided to specialize in loopholes. Over in the southeast, closer to the border with Chad, you get the Termit Massif, a lower, lonelier range where the Sahel finally gives up and hands things over to the true Sahara. It is remote, even by Niger's standards, which, given everything we have just described, is genuinely saying something. Back in 2012, the government carved out a nature and cultural reserve here, covering roughly 100,000 square kilometres, folding in both the Massif and the vast, empty Tintuma Desert beside it. That makes it the largest single protected area on the entire African continent, an area big enough to swallow several small nations whole, set aside specifically because almost nobody else wanted it. Somewhere in there, gazelles, ostriches, and a small stubborn population of addax antelope are still holding out, doing their best impression of a species that has not gotten the memo about the desert closing in. Finally, tucked into the far southeastern corner where Niger, Nigeria, and Chad all meet, is a sliver of the Lake Chad basin. Lake Chad itself has shrunk dramatically over the last several decades, a slow ecological collapse driven by drought, irrigation demand, and a shifting climate, until what was once one of Africa's great inland seas is now a shadow of its former footprint. For the communities along its edges, that shrinking lake is not an abstract statistic. It is livelihoods disappearing in real time. It is, in miniature, the same story playing out across the whole country, water retreating, sand advancing, and human beings doing everything they can to hold the line. Which brings us to the most interesting twist in this entire chapter. Because here is the thing about deserts. They lie about their own past, constantly, confidently. And Niger might be the single best example of that on the planet, because as brutal and dry as it is today, this exact landscape used to be soaking, absurdly, almost comically wet. Scientists call it the African humid period, and everybody else just calls it the Green Sahara, and it is one of the wildest climate flips in human history. Roughly between 14,800 and 5,500 years ago, a slow wobble in the tilt of the Earth's axis strengthened the West African monsoon and dragged it hundreds of kilometers further north than it reaches today. The result was that the Sahara, this same brutal furnace we just spent 6 paragraphs describing, spent thousands of years as rolling grassland and open woodland, stitched together with rivers and permanent lakes across what is now Niger, Chad, Mali, and Libya. It is the geological equivalent of finding out your grumpiest, driest relative used to be the life of the party. And we are not talking about a light drizzle turning sand slightly damp. Picture wide, shallow lakes ringed with reeds, herds of elephants wading through the shallows, giraffes browsing acacia trees, hippos and crocodiles doing crocodile and hippo things in water that, today, simply does not exist. Nile perch the size of a grown man cruised through lakes that have long since evaporated into gravel. Pythons stretched out in the shade. It would have looked, more or less, like the Serengeti, except stacked directly on top of what is now one of the most lifeless deserts on the planet. And here is the part that tends to blow people's minds when they hear it for the first time. This was not some remote geological era beyond human reach. People were there for the entire show, the whole time. We know that in large part because of the rock art, and Niger happens to have some of the best on earth. Out near a site called Dabours, right where the Tenere Desert runs up against the base of the Aïr Massif, someone carved 2 giraffes directly into a sloped sandstone outcrop, and they did not hold back. The larger of the two stands roughly 5.5 meters tall, life-sized, rendered with such careful shading and detail that from certain angles it looks less like a carving and more like the giraffe simply walked into the rock and got stuck there. Most researchers date the Dabo's carvings to somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 years ago, squarely inside the Green Sahara, when giraffes ambling across northern Niger was not a fantasy but a Tuesday afternoon. A French archaeologist named Christian Dupuy formally documented them in 1987, though local herders had known about them for generations, in the same low-key way you might know about a good shortcut nobody bothered to write down. Now, the discovery that really deserves its own dramatic music sting happened out in the Tenere itself, at a place called Gobero, and it happened almost by accident. Around the year 2000, a photographer named Mike Hetwer was out with a paleontologist named Paul Serino, hunting for dinosaur bones, of all things, when he wandered off and stumbled across human skeletons lying right on the surface of the sand. Serino's team came back to excavate properly a few years later, and what they found was staggering. Somewhere around 200 burials, making Gobero the oldest and largest known cemetery in the entire Sahara. It sat on the shore of a paleo lake, a lake that has been gone for millennia. And the skeletons were not from one culture, they were from 2, separated by a gap of thousands of years, which is where this story gets genuinely eerie. The older group, called the Kifian, lived here around 9,700 years ago, right at the wettest peak of the Green Sahara, and they were, frankly, enormous. Some of the men stood well over 6 feet tall, and they hunted and fished with a level of ambition that matches their size, harpooning Nile perch, wild cattle, and even the occasional hippo out of that lake. Then, sometime later, the climate stuttered. A dry spell rolled through, the lake likely shrank or vanished, and the Kifian either moved on or died out, leaving the shoreline empty for a long, silent stretch of time before anyone showed up again. When people did come back, roughly 6,500 years ago, They were a different population entirely. Smaller in stature, known to archaeologists as the Tenerian, and one of their burials is honestly one of the most quietly devastating finds in all of prehistory. About 5,300 years ago, someone laid a woman and 2 children, probably her own, into a shared grave, arms wrapped around one another, hands still touching after the flesh had long since gone. Pollen recovered from beneath the bones shows they were laid to rest on a bed of flowers, with a scatter of arrowheads placed alongside them. Nobody knows exactly what killed them, but somebody who loved them arranged that goodbye with enormous care, in a landscape that, back then, still had flowers to spare. It is the kind of detail that makes 10,000 years suddenly not feel very long at all. And here is the twist that makes Niger properly unforgettable. Sereno's crew was not even looking for any of that. They were there hunting dinosaurs, and it turns out this same stretch of the Tenere is one of the richest dinosaur graveyards on the planet, at a site called Gadufawa. Long before it was a lake, long before it was a desert, this patch of Niger was a lush, meandering river delta, roughly 112 to 125 million years ago, during the early Cretaceous. It is the same green then dry story as the human chapter, just replayed on a timescale that makes 10,000 years look like a rounding error. Pulled out of that formation is Nigersaurus, an almost cartoonishly strange sauropod with a flat, wide muzzle packed edge to edge, with more than 500 replaceable teeth, built less like a typical long-necked dinosaur and more like a 50-foot lawnmower that grazed low, dense vegetation non-stop. Sharing that same riverbank was Sushomimus, a spinosaurid whose name literally translates to crocodile mimic, stretching some 10 to 11 meters long and built with a long, narrow, croc-like snout clearly meant for snatching fish straight out of the water. 2 entirely different survival strategies evolved side by side in a Niger that had rivers, fish, and thick green cover instead of the wall of sand sitting there now. So by the time we are done here tonight, we will have walked this exact stretch of desert through 3 completely different lives: a fisherman's lake, a dinosaur's river delta, and, somewhere in between, the empty gravel plain it is today. And we have not even gotten to the humans who came after Gobero yet. That is a story for next time. Chapter 2: The Snake, the Sultan, and the Salt Caravan. So, the humans who came after Gobero, let's talk about them, because it turns out abandoning a fishing village on a drying lake is not exactly a peaceful retirement plan. Picture it. The Green Sahara is packing up. The rains are thinning out, the grasslands are curling at the edges like old paper, and generation by generation, the people who once speared catfish where there is now 300 meters of orange sand start walking. South, mostly, toward the Niger River, toward the marshy fringe of the Sahel, toward, eventually, a shrinking lake far to the southeast that was once one of the largest bodies of fresh water in Africa. Not one dramatic exodus with trumpets and camels in slow motion. Centuries of slow, grinding relocation, one dry season at a time, families following the water because the water stopped following them. And where all those displaced, increasingly organized people eventually landed, kingdoms started to grow. Actual kingdoms, with actual kings. This is where Niger's political history begins in earnest. Somewhere around the 9th century, on the northeastern shore of Lake Chad, well outside modern Niger's borders, but bear with me, a kingdom called Kanem started to coalesce. It was founded, according to tradition, by a dynasty called the Sayfawa. And this is the part where you need to sit up, because the Sayfawa were about to pull off one of the single longest unbroken runs of any ruling family in recorded human history. Not decades, not a couple of centuries. This lineage and its successor state stayed in power from roughly the 9th century all the way to the 19th. That is over 1,000 years of the same royal family, give or take a civil war or two, which is the political equivalent of a restaurant staying in business, under the same owners, since before the printing press existed. Empires this durable do not happen by accident. They happen because somebody found a very, very good business model. And the business model was location. Lake Chad sits at the southern hinge of a trade route running north across the Sahara through a chain of oases in the Fezzan, all the way to Tripoli on the Mediterranean coast, which meant Kanem, and its later incarnation Kanem-Bornu, controlled the tap on an enormous flow of goods moving in both directions. Southbound came salt, horses, silk, glass beads, and eventually muskets. Northbound went natron, cotton, cola nuts, ivory, ostrich feathers, wax, and perfume, an entire luxury catalogue, crossing one of the harshest environments on the planet, one camel step at a time. And yes, before you get too dreamy about the perfume and the ivory, the single most valuable export moving north was people. Enslaved people marched across the desert as part of the exact same caravan economy that carried the wax and the cola nuts, which is the kind of detail that tends to get left off the tourist brochure. So that was the trade route. Beautiful goods, terrible cargo, same camels. Kanem-Bornu's reach eventually stretched across what are now 5 different countries, brushing the edges of Chad, Cameroon, Libya, Nigeria, and the eastern reaches of Niger itself, which is where this empire finally becomes our problem, and not just a fascinating neighbour. Along with the caravans came something else entirely: Islam. It did not arrive with armies. It arrived with merchants, the way most durable things in West African history seem to. Around the 11th century, the ruling Sayfawa king converted, likely nudged along by Muslim traders from Tripoli and the Nile Valley, who frankly made better business partners if you shared a religion and a legal system with them. Here's the part that's genuinely interesting, though. The king converting did not mean the kingdom converted. Islam settled comfortably into the palace for centuries, while most ordinary people kept right on practicing what they had always practiced. Top-down religious change, moving at the speed of a camel, taking hundreds of years to trickle all the way down, which honestly tracks. Meanwhile, south and west of all this, in what's now southern Niger and northern Nigeria, a completely different political tradition was brewing. Not one empire radiating out from a single lake, but a cluster of independent, fiercely competitive city-states, all speaking the same language, all claiming the same ancestry, and all thoroughly convinced they were the real deal. These are the Hausa, and if Kanem-Bornu was one long, stable dynasty, the Hausa world was more like 7 siblings who all inherited the family business and have never once agreed on how to run it. There were 7 of these core states, known collectively as the Hausa Bakwai, the 7 true Hausa states. And the origin story they tell about themselves is, without question, the single best legend in this entire chapter. It involves a hero, a queen, a cursed well, and a snake. I am not exaggerating for the podcast. This is just what happened, allegedly. Here's the story. Sometime around the 9th century, a traveller named Bayajidda shows up in the town of Dara, tired, dusty, presumably regretting several of his life choices. Dara has one well, just one, and that well is guarded quite literally by a giant snake named Saki, who has arranged things so the townspeople are only allowed to draw water one day a week, Everybody else 6 days out of 7 just has to be thirsty and deal with it, because nobody has managed to kill the snake. Imagine your entire town's water supply being run by one extremely committed reptile with an inflexible schedule and no customer service line. That is the situation Bayajidda walks into. And rather than filing a complaint like a reasonable person, he draws his sword, waits for his day, and kills the snake on the spot, presumably to thunderous applause from several hundred extremely relieved, extremely dehydrated people. The local ruler at the time was a Queen Magagia Daurama, the last in a whole line of ruling queens in Daura, a title that translates roughly to Queen Grandmother, which is a genuinely wonderful thing to be called. Grateful, and possibly also impressed, she marries the snake-slaying stranger. Their son, a boy named Bawo, grows up and has 6 sons of his own. And here is the punchline the legend has been building to the entire time. Those 6 grandsons, plus Bawo himself, become the founding rulers of the 7 Hausa Bakwai states, Dora, Kano, Katsina, Zaria, Rano, Gobir, and Biram. 1 travelling stranger, 1 dead snake, 1 marriage, and 2 generations later, you have an entire regional political map, all supposedly descended from the same family reunion. Is it literal history? Almost certainly not. Is it a strangely honest way of explaining how 1 trade network and 1 language spread into 7 competing kingdoms? Yes, completely. A few of these states, Gobir especially, eventually pushed their territory north into what is now southern Niger, chasing farmland and trade routes the way ambitious kingdoms always do. And there's a detail buried in that legend worth sitting with for a second. Dora's ruler, before Bayajidda ever showed up, was a queen, part of a whole dynasty of queens. The legend marks the moment a foreign man arrives, kills the resident monster, and takes over, as the exact moment rulership flips from women to men. Most legends are not accidents. They are communities explaining, to themselves, how something changed. And whatever actually happened in Dora 1,000-odd years ago, something clearly did. Now let's head northeast, back into the Aya Mountains, to a city that is, without competition, the single most photogenic thing in this entire country. Agadez. Around the start of the 15th century, Tuareg clans, the same nomadic, indigo-veiled desert people who had been crisscrossing the Sahara for centuries, formalized themselves into a confederation with an actual sultan at the head of it. By the middle of that century, Agadez itself had been named the capital, and the Sultanate of Agadez was open for business. Sitting directly across the crossroads of the Trans-Saharan trade network, like a toll booth built out of mud brick and camel dung, salt came down from the desert mines to the north. Gold came up from the forests of West Africa. Textiles arrived from across the Mediterranean world. And Agadez, sitting in the exact middle of all of it, took its cut of every single caravan that passed through. And people did not just trade goods here, they showed up in person, from every direction at once. Tuareg and Berbers came down from the north. Arab traders arrived from the east. Hausa, Songhai, and Fulani merchants came up from the south and west. Within a couple of generations, Agadez was a genuinely cosmopolitan desert city, the kind of place where 4 or 5 languages might get shouted across the same marketplace on any given morning, all of them arguing, almost certainly, about the price of salt. If you're picturing something like a medieval airport hub, except everyone travels by camel and the departure lounge is a mud brick courtyard, you are not far off. It is worth remembering, next time you are stuck in an actual airport complaining about a delayed flight, that people have been doing some version of this exact thing, tired and irritable in a crossroads city, for about 600 years. The single most important commodity moving through Agadez was salt, mined out of the desert oasis of Bilma, several hundred kilometers east across the Tenere, yes, the same Tenere where the Kiffian and Tenerian fishers were buried, back when it was a lake instead of an oven. Twice a year, enormous camel caravans called the Azalai set out from Agadez, crossed 3 weeks of open desert, and came back loaded down with slabs of salt. And unlike most trans-Saharan routes, where the profits tended to funnel off toward North African merchants, the Tuareg here kept the lion's share for themselves. Sharp business sense, or just leverage. When you control the only reliable route across several hundred kilometers of nothing, you get to set the terms. And here's the detail that still gets me. This caravan still runs. Not constantly, and not by camel most of the time. Any more trucks have taken over most of the route, but the Azalai has never fully stopped. 600 years, and counting. None of this made Agadez invincible, mind you. Early in the 16th century, the Sultanate got swallowed up by the much larger Songhai Empire, sweeping in from the west along the Niger River, and for a while Agadez was somebody else's tax base instead of its own. But the city was too useful, too perfectly positioned, to stay conquered for long. The Tuareg clawed their autonomy back, the trade kept flowing, and Agadez kept right on being the place every camel caravan in the region had to pass through eventually. It is a very specific kind of survival, not through winning every fight, but through being too economically indispensable to abandon. Empires would rise and fall around it for centuries. Agadez, more or less, just kept selling salt. And if you want one image to hold on to from this whole chapter, make it this one. Rising out of the middle of Agadez is the Great Mosque, first built around the middle of the 15th century and rebuilt more than once since, with the minaret you would recognize today going up in the mid-1800s. That minaret is roughly 27 meters tall. Call it an 8 or 9 story building built entirely out of sun-dried mud brick, a material locals call banco. Mud, gravel, and straw, baked hard under the Saharan sun. It is, by most measures, the tallest mud brick structure on the planet. For centuries it has done double duty, calling the faithful to prayer and acting as a literal landmark, visible for a considerable distance across flat desert, guiding caravans home. A giant handmade mud tower, built to survive centuries of sun and wind with no steel, no concrete, nothing but dirt and stubbornness. It is still standing. It is, somehow, still exactly that tall. So that's the shape of it. A 1,000-year dynasty running trade out of Lake Chad. 7 kingdoms supposedly descended from one snake-slaying stranger and a queen called Grandmother. A desert sultanate that got conquered, shrugged it off, and kept selling salt anyway, out of a city with a mud tower taller than most buildings you'll walk past this week. None of these societies knew about each other's endings. None of them knew a river valley kingdom to their west was about to eclipse them all, or that a religious reform movement was coming that would redraw the entire map in fire and scripture. They were just doing what kingdoms do, trading, marrying, converting, arguing over wells one ordinary Tuesday at a time, while history quietly loaded the next chapter behind them. And there was a great deal more coming. Empires at their absolute peak, and a very different kind of upheaval about to arrive from the west. That's a story for next time. Chapter 3. Guns, God, and the Walls of Zinder. Okay, so remember that upheaval we teased, the one arriving from the west. Here it comes. Picture the Niger River doing its big lazy bend through what's now Mali, a few hundred kilometers west of Agadez, and on its banks a warlord named Soni Ali is currently having the best few decades of his life. He inherited a modest riverine kingdom around 1464, and within about a generation turned it into the largest state West Africa had ever seen, swallowing the collapsing Mali Empire whole in the process. This is the Songhai Empire, and if you were a Tuareg trader in Agadez at the time, you'd have felt the ground shift, because the new power on the block was about to take a very personal interest in your salt caravans. Sonny Ali was, by most accounts, an absolute terror to be around. Brilliant general, tireless campaigner, and deeply, publicly unbothered by the opinions of the Muslim scholars in Timbuktu, who found his blend of Islam and older traditional practice somewhere between concerning and heretical. He didn't care. He had an empire to build and a river to control, and theological disapproval doesn't stop cavalry. It's the 15th century equivalent of a founder who ignores every piece of feedback from the board and somehow keeps winning anyway, right up until he doesn't. Because around 1492, Sonny Ali died under murky circumstances, supposedly drowned crossing a river, which is either poetic or just extremely unlucky, and the throne passed to his son, Sonny Baru. Sonny Baru would not get to enjoy it for long. Here's where things get interesting, or treacherous, usually both. One of Sonny Ali's own generals, a man named Muhammad Ture, looked at the new king and decided the empire needed, let's say, new leadership with a stronger religious brand. In April of 1493, he defeated Sonny Baru at the Battle of Anfao and took the throne himself, adopting the name Askia Muhammad. Strip away the pious framing and what you're looking at is a boardroom coup with a holy war costume on. Out with the old regime and its uncomfortable relationship with the clergy. In with a ruler who very publicly loved Islam and, not coincidentally, loved the legitimacy it brought him. The Askia dynasty he founded would run the empire for the rest of its existence, and Askia Muhammad did not waste a single day of it. He pushed the empire's borders west into the Futa Toro region, and then he turned his attention east, toward a certain desert trading post you already know. He ordered his armies to found a colony in and around Agadez, in the Air Massif, specifically to seize control of the trans-Saharan caravan markets running through it. Remember Agadez? That proud little Tuareg sultanate with its salt routes and its not yet built mud tower. It got folded into Songhai's orbit, taxed and administered from a river valley hundreds of kilometers away. This is the thing about being sat on top of valuable trade routes. Sooner or later somebody bigger notices, and being conquered becomes less of a possibility and more of a scheduling matter. By the time Askia Muhammad was done, the empire stretched from the Atlantic coast near modern Senegal all the way to Kano in Hausa land, with the salt mines of Taghaza anchoring the northern edge. For scale, imagine an empire running from roughly the coast of Portugal to somewhere past Vienna, except entirely on foot and camel, with no paved roads anywhere. Askia Muhammad still tried to tax all of it, introducing standardized weights and measures and posting trade inspectors at the major markets, which, I know, doesn't sound thrilling. But it's basically medieval middle management at imperial scale. And it worked. Trade flourished. Timbuktu, already a byword for scholarship, became even more of a magnet for Islamic learning under his patronage, pulling in students and manuscripts from across the region. Dry as tax policy sounds, it's the reason the empire actually held together, instead of just being a very large area that occasionally paid tribute when asked nicely. But the real flex came in 1496, when Askia Muhammad set off on the Hajj to Mecca, and he did not travel light. His entourage numbered around 1,000 soldiers and 500 horsemen, and he brought along roughly 300,000 mithqals of gold, something in the neighbourhood of 1 1/3 metric tons. which he distributed generously along the entire route and in the holy cities themselves. Picture showing up to a work conference and just handing out gold bars to everyone you meet in the lobby. That's the energy. It worked spectacularly. The Sharif of Mecca reportedly granted him the title Caliph of the Sudan, which is about as strong a stamp of religious legitimacy as a West African ruler could possibly obtain, and Askir Muhammad brought that authority home and used it for the rest of his reign. Everything was thriving. The empire was enormous, the gold was flowing, Timbuktu was buzzing with scholars, and Agadez's salt caravans were dutifully paying their new landlord, which, as we've established, is exactly the moment history likes to reach for the record scratch. Because up in Morocco, a sultan named Ahmad al-Mansur looked south at all that trans-Saharan wealth and decided he wanted a piece of it. In 1591, he did something borderline insane. He sent an army across the Sahara Desert, roughly 2,000 kilometers of sand, to go take it. His force numbered only about 4,000 men. Songhai, by contrast, could field around 22,000, split between roughly 12,500 cavalry and 9,700 infantry. On paper, this should not have been close. Here's the twist nobody in Gao saw coming. The Moroccan force carried arquebuses and cannons. The Songhai army, for all its numbers and all its horsemen, carried none. The two sides met at a place called Tondibi, just north of the Songhai capital, on the 12th of April, 1591. The Songhai infantry charged. The Moroccan gunners opened fire. And that, more or less, was that. It's the single cleanest illustration in West African history of what happens when you bring extremely good cavalry to a gunfight. The remaining Songhai forces broke and scattered. Gao fell almost immediately, and Moroccan troops went on to loot Timbuktu and Jen in turn. The empire that had stretched from the Atlantic to Hausa land, that had funded a legendary Hajj and taxed half the Sahel, collapsed within a matter of months. So that was, dramatically, more than just a Tuesday. Askir Ishak II, the last Askir holding real power, died the following year, and Songhai simply came apart, splintering into a dozen smaller successor kingdoms while the exhausted Moroccan garrison, the so-called armour, discovered that conquering the river cities was a great deal easier than actually governing the vast dry interior around them. The trans-Saharan trade network didn't vanish, but its centre of gravity did, drifting away from a single dominant empire and out toward whoever could grab a piece of it. This is precisely why Agadez, back in the Air Massif, was able to shake off Songhai's grip and return to its own quiet Tuareg autonomy, salt caravans and all. A vacuum had opened up across the whole region, and in the centuries that followed, new powers would rush in to fill it, mostly on the eastern and southern edges of what would eventually become Niger. One of those new powers grew up around a small Hausa village nobody outside the neighbourhood had heard of, called Zengu. Sometime around 1731, a band of Kanuri settlers led by a man named Malam Yunus left the Kanem heartland near Lake Chad and set up shop there. And by 1736 they'd built a fortified quarter called the Burney and declared the whole settlement the capital of a new state, the Sultanate of Damagaram. You know it today by the name of that same town, grown considerably larger, Zinder. For its first century, Damagaram was politely, formally, a tributary of the old Bornu Empire, the successor to the Kanem dynasty we met last chapter. It paid its respects, sent its tribute, and generally behaved itself the way a franchise location defers to head office. That arrangement would not last forever. In the mid-19th century, under a ruler named Sultan Tanimun Dan Suleiman, Damagaram stopped asking permission. He effectively broke free of Bornu's authority and threw the Sultanate's resources into becoming the dominant power in eastern Niger outright, which meant, first and foremost, walls. Enormous ones, reportedly rising some 10 metres high around the Berni Quarter, the kind of fortification that says, quite bluntly, "We are not interested in being conquered today, thank you." Inside those walls, Zinder became a genuinely cosmopolitan trading hub, its markets crowded with Hausa, Tuareg, Fulani, and Kanuri merchants all doing business under one very well-defended roof. When the German explorer Heinrich Barth passed through around 1850, he described mud brick houses decorated with elaborate geometric relief patterns. Architecture so distinctive that versions of it still stand in Zinder's old quarter today, largely unchanged, which is more than you can say for most 19th century real estate. Damagaram's wealth, like most wealth in this story, came from three unglamorous but reliable sources: taxing the caravan trade passing through, taking a cut of the regional slave trade, and squeezing internal taxes out of its own population. None of that is pleasant to say out loud, and none of it should be softened. For the people actually captured and marched through those markets, this was not commerce, it was catastrophe delivered on a schedule. Families broken apart in an afternoon and never seen again. But it is, uncomfortably, the economic engine that built the walled city and funded its independence from Bornu, and pretending otherwise would just be dishonest. Damagaram spent the following decades doing a careful balancing act, staying formally respectful toward Bornu to its east while increasingly eyeing, and occasionally sparring with, an enormous new religious empire rising to its south and west, which brings us finally to that empire. Down in the Hausa state of Gobero, in what's now northern Nigeria but right on Niger's doorstep, a Fulani cleric named Usman Dan Fodio had spent decades teaching Islamic law and Sufi mysticism to increasingly large crowds. And here's the detail that should make you wince a little. One of his former students was a man named Yunfa, who grew up, became Gobere's sultan, and then turned around and persecuted his old teacher's religious community as it grew too large and too critical of the ruling elite for comfort. Imagine your old high school teacher having to flee the city because you, personally, decided he'd become a problem. In 1802, Dan Fodio and his followers went into exile. 2 years later, in 1804, he declared jihad, and the first target, unsurprisingly, given everything you just heard, was Gobero itself. This wasn't a fringe uprising that fizzled in a season. Ordinary Hausa peasants, worn down by heavy taxation and rulers they saw as drifting from proper Islamic practice, flocked to Dan Fodio's cause in genuinely enormous numbers. The revolt tore through Hausaland like a grass fire in dry season, sweeping up Kano, Katsina, Zaria and state after state besides. Gobero's capital fell in 1808, and Sultan Yunfa was killed in the fighting, which is about as thorough a professional consequence as a former student can hand his old teacher's enemies. In 1809, Dan Fodio formally founded the Sokoto Caliphate, and within roughly 3 years, almost every Hausa king across the region had been replaced by a Fulani emir answering to Sokoto. It would go on to become one of the largest states in 19th century Africa, reaching into what's now northern Cameroon and parts of Niger itself. And here's the part that matters most for our story. Gobero's royal family didn't just vanish when their capital fell. Its surviving nobles fled north out of reach of Sokoto's new emirs, into the territory that is today southern Niger. They regrouped, moved once, and by 1836 had established a new capital at Tiberi, near modern Maradi, with a little help from the neighbouring ruler of Katsina. A rump kingdom of Gobero, stubbornly persisting on the desert edge, out of Sokoto's easy reach, still headed by the pre-jihad royal line. That same year, When this remnant tried pushing back militarily, Sokoto's forces crushed the rebellion at the Battle of Gawakuke. But the dynasty itself never fully disappeared. It's the kind of detail that sounds like a footnote and is actually the whole point. Empires can redraw every border they touch and still leave a stubborn splinter of the old order camped just outside the new one, refusing, quietly, to read the memo. So picture the map around 1800, right before any of this settles into something Europeans would recognize as a country. Up north and through the centre, Tuareg confederations hold the desert and the air massif. Agadez independent again and running its salt routes exactly as it pleases. To the east, Damagaram is climbing out from under Bornu's shadow, walls rising around Zinder, becoming the region's new heavyweight. Down south, the picture is split clean in two. Some Hausa territory has been absorbed into the sprawling new Sokoto Caliphate, ruled now by Fulani emirs, while a defiant sliver of the old Gobero dynasty holds out at Tiberi, just inside what will become Niger's border. No single ruler, no single flag, no single anything. Just 3 or 4 proud, well-armed neighbours eyeing each other warily across the Sahel, which of course is exactly the kind of fractured, ready-made opportunity a certain group of Frenchmen was about to notice. Chapter 4. The Captain Who Declared Himself King. Okay, the Frenchman. Let's talk about the Frenchman. By the 1890s, France had a map problem, or rather a map ambition, which is worse. It already held Senegal on the Atlantic coast and a sprawling, half-mapped chunk of the Sudan further inland, and it wanted one continuous ribbon of French territory stretching all the way from the coast of West Africa to Lake Chad and beyond, ideally without any inconvenient British or German colonies interrupting the view. The plan, drawn up by men in Paris who had never smelled the Sahel in the dry season, was elegantly simple. Send 3 military columns converging on Lake Chad from 3 different directions: Algeria in the north, the French Congo in the south, and Senegal in the west, and let them meet in the middle like a slightly murderous family reunion. On paper, it was a triumph of imperial logistics. In practice, it was about to become one of the ugliest chapters in the entire history of French colonialism, and the western column is the one that walks straight through Niger. That western column left Dakar in the second half of 1898 under the joint command of 2 young captains, Paul Voulet and Voulet-Chanoine, both of them ambitious, both of them decorated, and both of them, it would turn out, spectacularly unsuited to being given a private army and no supervision. Their orders were straightforward enough: march east, subdue whatever stood in the way, link up with the other columns near Lake Chad, and hand France a continuous stripe of empire across the map. They set off with several hundred African soldiers, mostly Senegalese tirailleurs, plus a horde of porters conscripted along the way to carry the mission's food, ammunition, and, this being colonial France, its wine. It looked, at the outset, like fairly standard imperial business for the era. It would not stay that way for long. And if you're getting a familiar prickle of dread right about now, congratulations, you've been paying attention to this channel. Here's the thing about marching an armed column of several hundred men across a region with no reliable supply lines. You need food, you need porters, and you need water. And if the locals don't hand those over fast enough, an already brutal military culture starts filling the gap with violence. Voulet and Chanoine had both been given considerable latitude and essentially zero oversight, a combination that should worry you in any century, and within months the mission had curdled into something closer to a rolling atrocity than a march. Villages that resisted, or simply didn't move fast enough, were burned. People who protested were executed on the spot, sometimes as an example for the ones who hadn't protested yet. This wasn't rogue soldiers freelancing behind their officers' backs. This was policy, set from the top, by two men who had discovered that unlimited force, unsupervised, does something specific and terrible to the people wielding it. Not everyone in the mission's path simply stood aside, though, and this next part is worth slowing down for, because it's one of the few genuinely triumphant threads running through this chapter. In the town of Lugu, near what's now Dogondouchi in southern Niger, the local ruler was a woman named Sarauniya Mangu, a priestess queen of the Asna people, part of the wider Hausa-speaking world but stubbornly holding on to older animist traditions rather than Islam. She was, by every account that survives her, formidable, feared by neighbours long before the French ever showed up, and when Voulet's column reached Lugu in April of 1899, she did not do what a great many rulers in this story had done and simply capitulate. She fought. The Battle of Lugu did not go the way you'd expect from the numbers alone. French rifles against Sarauniya's spears and arrows should have been a formality, and for the initial assault on her fortress, it more or less was. But instead of collapsing, she and her fighters melted into the surrounding thicket, a nearly impenetrable tangle of bush that the French, weighed down and unfamiliar with the terrain, could not effectively pursue them into. From there she ran a running guerrilla campaign, harassing the column night after night, until Voulet's men simply gave up trying to fully subdue her and moved on. It's a small, sharp footnote of actual resistance succeeding, at least partially against overwhelming firepower, and it's the reason Sarauniya Mangu is remembered in Niger today as a symbol of defiance rather than another name in a casualty list. Not every story in this chapter ends like hers. Most don't. The next stop was Bernie and Connie, and here the mission's descent stops being a metaphor and just becomes a body count. In early May of 1899, Voulet's forces descended on the town and killed its inhabitants in numbers that estimates put at several hundred in a single day, with some accounts running considerably higher. Entire settlements along the route were burned to their foundations, corpses left hanging at village entrances as a kind of grotesque signage for whoever came next. Porters who slowed the march were beheaded, and women and children were killed in numbers that made even other French officers, men not exactly famous for their squeamishness in this era, start writing worried letters home. Try, for one uncomfortable second, to picture being a farmer in that path, not a soldier, not a rebel, just someone who planted a field and built a home, and then two French captains and their army arrived. So that, unforgivably, was Tuesday. Repeatedly. Word of all this eventually reached Paris, because it turns out that even a 19th century colonial ministry has a limit, and by mid-1899 the reports coming back from the Sahel were bad enough to trigger genuine alarm. The French government dispatched Lieutenant Colonel Jean-François Klob, a senior officer with real authority, to catch up with the column, relieve Voulet and Chanoine of their command, and bring the whole operation back under some semblance of civilized control. Klob rode hard across hundreds of kilometers of Sahel to do it, which, credit where due, is not a small logistical achievement in 1899. He finally caught up with the mission in mid-July. And this is the point in the story where you'd expect the adults to arrive and the crisis to end. Instead, it's where things get worse. On the 14th of July, 1899, Klob's advance party made contact with Voulet's column, and rather than accept the recall, Voulet and Chanoine had their own men open fire on their superior officer. Klob, the man sent specifically to stop the bleeding, was shot dead by the very mission he'd been ordered to rein in. It's hard to overstate how far outside the normal bounds of even brutal colonial conduct that single act sat. Killing local civilians was appallingly, almost routine for this kind of expedition in this era. Murdering a superior French officer sent to arrest you was something else entirely. A line that essentially didn't exist until Voulet crossed it, and once he had, there was genuinely nothing left constraining him. Whatever thin membrane of military discipline had been holding this mission together finally, audibly, snapped. What happened next is the single strangest scene in this entire 6-chapter story, so let it land properly. Voulet gathered his remaining officers, stripped the French insignia from his own uniform, and announced, more or less verbatim, that he was no longer a Frenchman, that he was now a black chief, and that together with the men still standing beside him, he intended to found his own empire in the African interior. Picture your manager walking into a meeting, taking off his lanyard, and announcing he's founding a breakaway kingdom with whoever in the room still likes him. His officers did not share his enthusiasm. Neither, as it turned out, did his troops, who had spent the better part of a year watching this man burn villages and now watched him casually murder a French colonel, and who were, understandably, beginning to wonder who exactly was next on that list. They didn't wait to find out. Within 2 days, an informer tipped Voulet off that his own Senegalese tirailleurs were about to mutiny, and Voulet's response, characteristically, was to have the informer shot in front of the assembled troops as a warning. It did not work as a warning. It worked as a trigger. The soldiers, the same men who'd been marching, killing and dying under Voulet-Chanoine's orders for the better part of a year, turned their rifles on the men giving those orders. Within roughly 48 hours, both captains were dead, killed by the very column they had terrorized into following them this far. There is a version of justice in that, grim and unofficial as it is, and also, frankly, a pretty solid one-line moral for the whole colonial project. Eventually, the people you're standing on tend to stand up. The mission itself, oddly, didn't die with its commanders. 2 remaining lieutenants, Joland and Mania, pulled the shattered column back together and, astonishingly, kept going, eventually linking up with the other French forces converging on Lake Chad and helping finish off a regional warlord named Rabi Zubaya, technically completing the very objective Voulet and Chanoine had been sent to accomplish in the first place. Back in Paris, the scandal caused a genuine public uproar, a formal inquiry, some career-ending censure for a handful of officials. And then, with the efficiency France has always reserved for its most embarrassing colonial moments, it was quietly filed away. It barely appears in French schoolbooks even now. It's only in recent years that French officials have even signalled openness to discussing reparations for what happened here, which tells you roughly how long a really thorough cover-up can last. With the messy part finished, or at least buried, the actual administrative business of colonization could proceed, and France did what France always did next, which is rename things repeatedly until everyone stopped asking questions. The Zinder military territory was declared in July of 1900, upgraded to the military territory of Niger in 1904, promoted again to the plain territory of Niger in 1920, and finally, in 1922, formalized as the full colony of Niger, one piece in the enormous jigsaw of French West Africa. Zinder, still ringed by those walls you heard about last chapter, served as the colonial capital for its first 4 years. Then in 1926, Paris decided the river town of Niamey made better logistical sense for trade along the Niger River and moved the capital there instead, which is roughly the point at which Niger, on paper, starts looking like the country whose map you'd recognize today. Colonial rule itself, once established, ran on a familiar and thoroughly unglamorous playbook. Rather than replace every existing ruler, France mostly kept the old power structures standing and simply slotted itself in above them, which meant the Sultan of Zinder and the Sokoto-aligned Hausa emirs you met last chapter kept their titles, their palaces, and a great deal of their local authority, provided they collected taxes efficiently and never ever caused trouble. Underneath that thin veneer of continuity sat forced labour gangs building roads and rail lines for wages that were generously described symbolic, alongside a tax system that all but forced subsistence farmers into growing peanuts, or ground nuts if you prefer the local term, purely for French export markets. It's the same trick colonial administrations ran across half the continent. Make cash crops the only way to pay a cash tax, and suddenly everyone's farming your product whether they wanted to or not. Up in the Air Massif, the Tuareg were not thrilled about any of this, and in 1916 that frustration found a spark. A Tuareg leader named Cautzen, chief of the Ikazkazan Confederation, tied his rebellion to a wider religious call to arms from the Senussi order in Libya, and in December of that year his fighters, over 1,000 strong and armed partly with rifles captured from the Italians, laid siege to the French garrison at Agadez, with the local Sultan quietly playing both sides. For roughly 3 months the Air Massif was, in practical terms, not French territory at all. Then in March of 1917 a relief column arrived from Zinder, and the French response was every bit as brutal as you'd expect by now. Cautzen fled north into Libya, was captured, and was hanged there in 1919. A footnote of genuine resistance quietly extinguished a very long way from home. And then came the famine. In 1931, after decades of forced labour, punitive head taxes, and an economy increasingly bent toward exporting food rather than eating it, western Niger's harvest collapsed, and somewhere between 15,000 and 30,000 people starved to death. It was, by the grim arithmetic of colonial disasters, smaller than an earlier famine in 1913, which somehow makes it worse rather than better, because it means this wasn't a freak catastrophe. It was a system working exactly as designed, occasionally producing mass death as an acceptable operating cost. A handful of administrators were quietly reprimanded. Nothing structural changed. The peanuts kept moving toward the coast, the taxes kept coming due, and Niger settled into 4 more decades of being administered from Niamey by a government that had never once asked its people whether they wanted any of this. That, eventually, was going to become a problem. Chapter 5. Independence Interrupted. Well, eventually arrived. On August 3rd, 1960, France packed up its administrators, left the road signs in French, and Niger became, on paper at least, a fully sovereign nation. There was no dramatic handover scene, no torches passed in slow motion. Somewhere in Niamey there was almost certainly a very tired French official handing over a set of keys and a filing cabinet and saying, more or less, good luck with all this. The man accepting the keys was Hamani Diori, a former schoolteacher who'd spent the previous decade working the exact same colonial administrative machine he was now inheriting. He didn't dismantle it. He didn't really have the tools to, and to be fair, nobody had handed him any. He just changed the letterhead and kept the filing system. If you're picturing a triumphant new government tearing up the old rulebook and starting fresh, picture instead the same office, the same desk, and a new nameplate that took about a week to arrive. Here's a detail that tends to get skipped. 2 years before independence, in 1958, France had asked its West African colonies a yes or no question. Stay loosely attached to France, or cut the cord completely and go it entirely alone. Niger's most popular political voice at the time, a firebrand named Jibo Bakari who ran a party called Sawaba, campaigned hard for the clean break. He lost. Diori's more cautious, France-friendly faction won the vote, and within a year, Diori had banned Sawaba outright and driven Bakary into exile. So the man who actually wanted immediate independence never got to run the country he'd wanted independent, and spent the following years organising scattered guerrilla raids from across the border instead. Call it Niger's founding irony. The loudest voice for freedom got locked out of the building the moment freedom actually showed up. Diori settled in for what turned into 14 years of one-party rule, and he did it with the enthusiasm of a man who genuinely believed competition was for other countries. His party became the only legal party. Elections happened on schedule in 1965 and again in 1970, and Diori won both, which is a much less impressive sentence when you remember he was the only name on the ballot. This is, structurally, a pattern you've seen before if you were paying attention 2 chapters ago. Different flag, same administrative shape. Power flows down from Niamey, decisions get made by one man and his inner circle, and the vast rural majority of the country gets governed the same way it always has, from a distance, by people who rarely visit. Independence changed who was in the presidential chair. It changed remarkably little else. Think of it as a corporate rebrand, where the logo gets a fresh coat of paint and every single middle manager keeps their job, their office, and their extremely relaxed attitude toward accountability. And then the rain stopped, starting around 1968 and dragging on for 6 brutal years. The Sahel region slid into one of the worst droughts of the 20th century, and Niger, sitting right in the middle of that belt, took it about as hard as anywhere. Rainfall in the worst seasons dropped by something like 30 to 50% below normal. Herds that pastoralist families had spent generations building shrank by up to 80%, which if you want a modern equivalent is like watching 4/5 of your retirement savings evaporate. Except your retirement savings could also die of thirst. Millet and sorghum harvests failed outright across huge stretches of the country. Nobody has an exact death toll, because famines in poor countries in the 1970s rarely got precise accounting, but the estimates run into the tens of thousands. This wasn't a bad season. This was a slow-motion catastrophe that just kept not ending, year after year, long enough that an entire generation of Nigerian children grew up not knowing what a normal harvest was supposed to look like. Here's the part that should make your blood boil a little, and it's the kind of detail history sometimes hands you for free. While people were dying in the countryside, international food aid was pouring into Niger to help. And according to the man who eventually seized power off the back of this exact scandal, roughly 3,000 tons of grain sat rotting in a government warehouse, held back deliberately, because officials were waiting for prices to climb higher before releasing it. People were starving a short drive from a warehouse full of food because somebody further up the chain wanted a better return. That is not an accident of bad weather. That is a policy choice, and Nigerians noticed. Corruption allegations piled onto the drought allegations, and Diori's government, which had spent 14 years insisting it had everything under control, suddenly looked like it controlled nothing at all. So, on April 15th, 1974, the army showed up. A lieutenant colonel named Seyni Kunche led a coup that removed Diori from power in a matter of hours, with barely a shot fired, which by coup standards is practically a courtesy call. Kunche's stated reasoning was straightforward. Corruption, mismanagement, a government too busy with foreign diplomacy dinners to notice its own people starving. There were murmurs that France, deeply invested in Niger's mining interests, might have quietly welcomed the change. Kunche's first move rather undercut that theory. Within weeks, he expelled the commanding officer of the French military garrison, and shortly after, the rest of the French troops as well, accusing them of being patronizing toward Nigerian soldiers. Whatever Kunche was, he wasn't France's puppet. He was something arguably more interesting. A man who'd watched his country nearly starve while sitting on a fortune it hadn't yet learned to use, which is its own particular flavour of tragedy. The kind where the punchline is buried a few hundred metres underground the whole time. Because here's the thing that had been happening quietly in the background this whole time. Underneath the famine and the coup and all the political theatre, France's Atomic Energy Commission had been prospecting in the Aya region of northern Niger since the 1960s, and they'd found something enormous. Uranium deposits, seam after seam of them, discovered through the decade at sites with names that would soon matter a great deal. Arlit in 1965, Akuta in 1967. A mining company called Somer started digging at Arlit in 1971. A sister company called Cominac followed at Akauta a few years later. Niger, one of the poorest countries on the planet, a country that had just watched its own citizens starve inside its borders, turned out to be sitting on some of the richest uranium ore in the world. The nuclear age needed fuel. Niger had fuel. This should have been the turning point. For a while, it almost was. Global uranium prices spiked hard in the mid to late 1970s, partly riding the same energy anxieties that were sending oil prices through the roof, and Niger's treasury briefly filled up in a way it never had before. Niamey got new buildings, new roads, a flush of infrastructure spending that felt for a moment like the future had finally shown up. Kunche used the windfall to prop up famine relief programs and rebuild some credibility after the disaster that had brought him to power. But uranium booms, like most booms, come with an expiration date nobody bothers printing on the label. Through the 1980s, prices collapsed, the market dried up, and Niger's finances went from flush to genuinely dire almost as fast as they'd inflated. The country had briefly held a winning lottery ticket. It just hadn't read the fine print about how lottery payouts work. Kunche held on to power through all of this, ruling with the kind of grim, humorless efficiency you'd expect from a man who'd overthrown a government for being too soft on corruption. He wasn't about to be soft on anything himself. He survived multiple coup attempts against his own rule, which tells you something about how popular military dictatorships tend to be even when they're marginally more competent than the last one. Competence, it turns out, buys you patience. It doesn't buy you affection. Then, in November of 1987, Kunche died in a Paris hospital of a brain tumour, and power passed to his cousin, a general named Ali Saibu, in the kind of tidy succession that only really works in militaries and monarchies. Saibu kept the uniform and mostly kept the system, but the world outside Niger's borders was changing fast in the early 1990s. And it turns out you cannot actually seal a country off from an entire global mood. That global mood was democracy, or at least the demand for it, and it arrived in Niger the way it arrived almost everywhere that decade, through students who'd simply had enough. In February of 1990, police opened fire on a peaceful student march crossing a bridge in Niamey, killing at least 3 people, and rather than crushing the unrest, it detonated it. Strikes spread. Labour unions joined in. By 1991, Saibu had no choice but to convene something called a national conference, essentially inviting the entire country to show up and rewrite the rules. The conference did exactly that. It stripped Saibu of real power, left him as a figurehead, and set up a transitional path toward actual multi-party elections. For one brief moment, it looked like Niger might get to choose its own government for the first time in its history. Genuinely wild. If you think about it, 31 years of independence before anyone got a real vote. While Niamey was busy rewriting its constitution, the north was busy falling apart in a different way. Starting in 1990, Tuareg communities in the desert regions launched an armed rebellion, and the grievances weren't complicated once you actually looked at them. Decades of drought had devastated Tuareg pastoral life. Political power had always flowed from the south, from settled farming communities and the capital, while the Tuareg homeland in the north got treated as an afterthought. And then there was the uranium, sitting literally in Tuareg territory, generating export revenue that mostly flowed to Niamey and to French mining companies, while the communities living on top of it saw remarkably little of the money. Imagine watching trucks haul away rock that's making other people wealthy, from land your family has lived on for centuries, while your own children go without school books. That's not an abstraction. That's the entire rebellion in one image. It dragged on for 5 years before a peace accord finally landed in 1995. Multi-party democracy, once it arrived, turned out to be less stable than everyone had hoped, which, if you've been paying attention to this chapter, is exactly what you should have expected by now. Niger held its first real competitive election in 1993. It lasted about 3 years. In January of 1996, an army colonel named Ibrahim Bare Mainasara staged another coup, tossed out the elected government, then held a rigged election the following July that he conveniently won with just over half the vote. Nobody outside his own camp believed the count. Mainasara didn't get to enjoy his fraudulent mandate for long. In April of 1999, he was shot dead under murky circumstances, most likely by members of his own presidential guard, in what remains one of Niger's more efficient examples of workplace performance review. A transitional government took over, promised real elections, and for once actually delivered them. Those elections, held later in 1999, put a man named Mamadou Tanja into the presidential palace, and against every trend this chapter has established so far, he mostly just stayed there, governing with something resembling stability well into the 2000s. It wasn't perfect stability. It never is here. In February of 2007, a new armed group calling itself the Niger Movement for Justice picked the Tuareg rebellion back up almost exactly where the last one had left off, over the same grievance, uranium wealth flowing out of the north while the north stayed poor. Fighting disrupted mining operations, ambushes hit military convoys, and the whole thing dragged on for 2 more years before a Libyan-brokered ceasefire finally quieted things down in 2009. Same resource, same complaint, a full uranium price cycle later. Niger had built an entire economy, an entire political identity on top of a single mineral, and it kept generating the exact same argument every single time. So take stock of where this leaves things, heading toward the new millennium, a country that got its independence, then almost immediately traded French rule for one-party rule, then traded that for a drought that exposed just how hollow the whole system was, then discovered it was sitting on a literal fortune of nuclear fuel, and somehow still couldn't make that fortune reach the people standing closest to it. Coups came and went like weather systems. Presidents died in Paris hospitals and airport ambushes. And through every single regime change, one fact held steady with almost eerie consistency. The wealth kept moving out of the north, and the south kept running the country from Niamey. Tanja's stability, by the standards Niger had set for itself, looked almost miraculous. Almost 20 years of it, in fact, which for a country that had just spent 4 decades cycling through coups like a restaurant cycling through Tuesday specials, was practically a national record. It was also, as you're about to find out, not going to last. Chapter 6. The desert reinvents itself again. It didn't last. On the morning of February 18th, 2010, soldiers surrounded the presidential palace in Niamey and opened fire right in the middle of a cabinet meeting, which sums up how things tend to go in Niger by now. No warning, no negotiation, just gunfire during a meeting about budgets. Tanja was captured on the spot, and by that evening a group calling itself the Supreme Council for the Restoration of Democracy had taken over the airwaves, led by a man almost nobody outside the military had heard of, a mid-level officer named Salou Djibo. 2 years earlier, Tanja had dissolved parliament and pushed through a referendum handing himself 3 extra years in office. Niger's patience, it turned out, had an expiration date after all. Djibo had just found it. Here's the part that genuinely surprised people. Coup leaders in this part of the world have a well-earned reputation for saying temporary and meaning indefinitely, sometimes for decades at a stretch. Djibo did not do that. He announced a transitional timeline, stuck to it, and by April of 2011 handed power back to an elected civilian government and quietly returned to the barracks. In the entire history of this country, a coup leader voluntarily giving up power on schedule was basically a unicorn sighting. It's the political equivalent of someone borrowing your car and returning it with a full tank of gas, Niger noticed. So did the rest of the world, mostly because it happens so rarely anywhere that people write academic papers about it when it does. The man who inherited that tidy handover was Mahamadou Issoufou, a former mining engineer turned long-time opposition figure, who won the presidency in March of 2011 with close to 58% of the vote. After the previous chapter's parade of colonels and rigged elections, a normal democratic transfer felt almost suspicious, like finding out the other shoe simply wasn't going to drop. Issoufou ran again in 2016 and won a second term by a landslide, and the opposition called meaningless, since his main rival spent the campaign under arrest, and the opposition boycotted the runoff outright. 92% against essentially nobody is less a mandate and more a formality with extra paperwork. Still, by Niger's standards, 2 straight elections without a tank rolling into the capital was practically a golden age. Because trouble, as always around here, just moved addresses. Down in the Diffa region, hugging that shrinking sliver of Lake Chad from Chapter 1, a Nigerian militant group called Boko Haram started spilling across the border around 2015, attacks on villages, kidnappings, refugee camps swelling overnight with families who'd walked out of Nigeria with whatever they could carry. Niger declared a state of emergency in Diffa and joined a multinational task force with Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon and Benin, 4 countries suddenly on the same exhausted team. That same shrinking lake had, in a cruel bit of timing, become a corridor for exactly the kind of chaos that thrives when borders are long and patrols are thin. And that was only the eastern front. Out west, along the border with Mali, jihadist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and, later, the Islamic State, were exploiting a region so thinly governed that border security was more of a suggestion than a fact. Niger joined the G5 Sahel force alongside Mali, Chad, Mauritania, and Burkina Faso, with mixed results at best. The grimmest reminder of how badly this could go came in October of 2017, near a village called Tongo Tongo, when an ambush killed 4 American Green Berets alongside several Nigerian soldiers on what was supposed to be a routine patrol. It made international headlines for weeks, mostly because most Americans had no idea their own troops were even in Niger, which was rather the point. Quiet countries have a way of becoming very loud, very suddenly. Meanwhile, up in Agadez, the desert was busy reinventing its economy again, because apparently that's just what this country does. For decades, Agadez had run a modest tourism trade around its mud brick mosque and Tuareg culture. Then Libya collapsed into civil war in 2011, and almost overnight the old smuggling routes north stopped being a curiosity and became a superhighway. Agadez sat right at the choke point, the last real town before the empty stretch toward the Libyan border, and it pivoted hard. Guest houses became what locals called ghettos, holding areas where migrants waited for their turn north. Drivers who used to ferry tourists out to sand dunes started ferrying people fleeing poverty and war instead. 40 or 50 at a time, crammed into a pickup truck built for a fraction of that weight. At the route's peak, the United Nations estimated something like 4,000 migrants a week passed through Agadez without any paperwork, headed toward the Libyan coast and, they hoped, a boat to Europe. It became, briefly, one of the biggest informal economies in the country, bigger in its own way than anything the uranium mines further north ever managed for the average family. Drivers, fixers, guest house owners, checkpoint officials with a sudden lucrative case of selective blindness. Everyone up and down that chain was making a living off human desperation, an uncomfortable sentence to say out loud, but there it is. Niger didn't just have one export the world wanted badly enough to cause problems over. It had two. One came out of the ground, the other one walked. Europe, understandably, was not thrilled about any of this, and in May of 2015, under heavy pressure and funding from the European Union, Niger's government passed a law formally criminalizing migrant smuggling. On paper it looked like a win. Arrests went up, convoys shrank, and a wide-open trade suddenly had real legal teeth behind it. In practice, it mostly made an already dangerous journey worse. Drivers dodging patrols started avoiding roads entirely, cutting straight across open desert instead, and migrants got abandoned further from water and further from help. The death toll out in the Tenere crept up precisely because the smuggling had been driven underground rather than stopped. An entire local economy that had propped up Agadez for years collapsed almost overnight, a pattern you should be able to recite in your sleep by now. Every fix here seems to break something else first. Back in Niamey, though, something genuinely unprecedented was quietly building. Issoufou, having served his 2 constitutional terms, did the one thing almost nobody in this chapter's family tree had ever managed. He actually left. In 2021, his hand-picked successor, a longtime ally and former interior minister named Mohamed Bazoum, won the presidency in an election international observers broadly accepted as legitimate. When Bazoum was sworn in that April, it marked the first time in Niger's history that one elected president had peacefully handed power to another. 61 years of independence, 5 previous coups, several assassinations, and one memorable brain tumour in a Paris hospital, and it took until 2021 to pull off the single most basic function of a democracy. Better late than never. Though if you like to keep score, never had been running up quite a lead. Bazoum lasted a little over 2 years, which by the standards of this chapter alone is basically a lifetime achievement award. He leaned into counter-terrorism cooperation with France and the United States, and generally behaved like a man trying to drag his country towards stability through sheer stubborn competence. Then, on the morning of July 26, 2023, soldiers from his own presidential guard, the unit whose entire job was keeping him alive, sealed him inside the presidential palace along with his wife and son. The man in charge of that guard was a general named Hamani Diori, who had held the job for years and was, by most accounts, about to be replaced. Nothing sharpens a soldier's career instincts quite like the rumour of his own dismissal landing on his desk a few days too late. The rest unfolded with a speed that suggested somebody had, in fact, been thinking about this for a while. Within a day, Niger's army command publicly backed the takeover rather than risk a fight inside its own ranks. the military version of deciding an argument isn't worth losing your job over. On July 28th, Tiani appeared on state television and declared himself head of a new ruling body, the National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland, citing the usual grab bag of justifications: security decline, economic mismanagement, general dysfunction. It was Niger's fifth coup since independence, and its first in over a decade, meaning an entire generation who'd grown up under civilian rule got a crash course in exactly what their parents had been talking about all along. Some traditions apparently skip a generation and come roaring back anyway. The regional response was louder and angrier than anything Niger had seen after its previous coups. ECO was slapped on sanctions within days, gave the junta a 1-week deadline to reinstate Bazoum, and began openly discussing an actual invasion. Nigeria, right next door and the bloc's heavyweight, cut off electricity supply to parts of Niger to apply pressure. Crowds in Niamey responded by marching on the French embassy, tearing at its gates and setting fires outside, which tells you plenty about where public sympathy had landed. Mali and Burkina Faso, already run by their own juntas, announced that any strike on Niger would be treated as a declaration of war against them too. Faced with that math, ECOWAS's invasion talk quietly evaporated. The threat had been real, the follow-through was not. France and the United States fared even worse. Niger's new government severed military cooperation with France within weeks and demanded its troops leave, and by the end of 2023, French soldiers and their ambassador were gone, expelled after a standoff that dragged on for months. The Americans held on longer, hoping to keep their drone base near Agadez, a facility that had cost well over $100 million to build. It didn't work. By September of 2024, the last American troops had left that base too, closing the book on one of the most expensive military footprints the United States ever built in West Africa. Around the same time, the junta throttled uranium exports to France and stripped the French mining giant running the flagship mine near Arlit of its operational control, that same seam shaping Niger's fate since the 1960s. With its old partners gone, Niger did what Mali and Burkina Faso had already done. It turned east. The three juntas formalized a mutual defense pact called the Alliance of Sahel States, quit ECOWAS altogether, and Russian contractors, the rebranded successor to the infamous Wagner Group, now operating as Africa Corps, began showing up where French and American boots used to stand. Whether that turns out better for anyone remains, as of this recording, a genuinely open question. What's clear is Niger swapped one set of foreign soldiers for another and walked away from 6 decades of one alliance for a new one built on considerably less trust. None of this happened in a vacuum, and it's worth sitting for a moment with what daily life still looks like for most Nigerians underneath all that geopolitics. The country regularly sits at or near the very bottom of the United Nations Human Development Index, out of roughly 200 countries measured. It also has the highest birth rate on the planet, women having close to 7 children on average, straining schools and food supplies and farmland that the Sahara keeps quietly reclaiming, one dry season at a time. Food insecurity here is chronic, not occasional. None of that makes for a tidy ending, and we're not going to pretend otherwise. But it's the honest backdrop behind every coup, every uranium deal, and every foreign soldier who has ever set foot in this country, and it deserves one honest paragraph before we let this story rest for the night. So here we are, all the way back at the beginning, in a way. 10,000 years ago, this stretch of Sahara was green and lakeside, full of people who fished, buried their children in beds of flowers, and carved giraffes into stone as though they had all the time in the world. Then the rain moved on, the way rain does, and the people who stayed learned to live with less of everything except patience. That's the through line of this whole story. Empires rose out of gold and salt and folded. Colonizers drew lines that never made sense and left. Coups came and went like weather systems, uranium boomed and busted, and foreign soldiers arrived with ambitious plans and, sooner or later, packed up and went home. Through every one of those cycles, the people along that river, in those mountains, on the edge of that shrinking lake, simply kept going, adapting the way their ancestors at Gobero once adapted. One dry season, one hard year, one stubborn act of survival at a time. And maybe that's the thing worth carrying with you as you drift off tonight. Niger was never really the empty stretch of sand it looks like from an airplane window. It was a green lakeshore once, a dinosaur's river delta before that, and it will very likely be something else again. Long after this chapter of coups and mines and foreign soldiers has faded into the same sand that swallowed everything before it, the land keeps changing its mind. The people keep adapting anyway. Wherever you're listening from tonight, we hope you're warm, comfortable, and settled, and we hope this quiet, scorched, endlessly patient corner of the world has earned a small permanent place in your imagination. Sleep well. We'll see you next time.